सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The BRICS session is over in Johannesburg and we've had a tangible outcome. And that tangible outcome is that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, and our Prime Minister met. They had a very short conversation and they formalized what's been going on for some time. These are talks between our military commanders, corps commanders first, and then major generals to try and first bring about disengagement of troops along the line of actual control in East Ladakh and then to de-escalate them. Disengagement and de-escalation are different. If you look at the hierarchy of these processes, disengagement comes first, that is troops who are facing each other, they move some distance, and de-escalation is when you start moving your heavier units, particularly your strike units or your armor, artillery, etc., back to their bases. So good thing is that both have now said that they have instructed their commanders to expedite the movement in that direction. So that one tangible outcome came. The other important thing that happened at BRICS this time is that new members joined in. So earlier you had BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now 6 more have been added. They are Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Argentina, Ethiopia, Egypt. Ethiopia is an interesting member there because Ethiopia is a country which at one point was the rising star of Africa, then got into a lot of trouble because Ethiopian leader Abiy, he got the Nobel Prize for bringing about peace in his country, and then he unleashed war on a part of his country, and that became the Tigray conflict, which destroyed the country's economy. That conflict is now over, but he started another conflict in another region. So Ethiopia's entry is something interesting. It's also interesting politically because Ethiopia earlier was lionized and patronized by the Americans, particularly Abiy. He was lionized and patronized by the Americans, who also gave Ethiopia a special trading status. They've withdrawn it now. So Ethiopia now has been reaching out to China more and more. Once again, Iran coming in is politically very significant because Iran is a country that's a victim of American sanctions. I was almost inclined to say American and Western sanctions, but really Iran is a target of American sanctions, and many other countries are affected by this. We, for example, in India, we cannot buy oil from Iran. Our trade with Iran is very small. Would have been much bigger if the sanctions were not there. But so again, significant that a sanction hit country, that a major American sanctions hit country, and the country which is seen as a red rag by the Americans, by the American bull, that country has also been included in BRICS. So once again, is this an Indian move? I'd like to submit with great humility that this looks more like a Chinese move, because India sees no need to thumb its nose at the Americans, or India does not see any need to say, in diplomatic terms, troll the Americans. The Chinese have every need to do that. So that's the other country. Argentina, the third largest economy in southern Latin America, that is after Brazil and Mexico. Again, a powerful big country. Again, a big trading partner with China. And Saudi Arabia and UAE, very interesting. Both are allies of the Americans, very close allies of the Americans. Armed forces of the two are almost fully equipped with American or Western European weapons. UAE is also now a participant in I2U2 alliance, that is India, Israel, UAE, USA. So to that extent is a member of many American-led alliances, right? And has normalized its relationship with Israel. Saudi Arabia is on its way there. That's a work in progress. Now these two countries have also come into BRICS, once again in the Chinese sphere of influence. Like it or not, but BRICS is under the Chinese sphere of influence. And the reason I am doing this particular episode of Cut The Clutter is to use data to tell you what a strong overhang the Chinese have over BRICS. And I am using it I'm using data purely from trade and the economy, GDP, so on and so forth to make that point to you. So look at some graphics. Look at trade first. Mainly, we'll tell the story of the Chinese domination of BRICS through trade. So look at trade first. So look at our graphic 1. If you look at our graphic 1, I'm doing it relative to where India features in BRICS, because that is the easiest way for us to focus, because we have to say where India features, say in the trade hierarchy of BRICS. So if you see old BRICS, in that BRICS, India's total trade deficit with BRICS countries was $125 billion. Remember also, we are making these calculations according to the Indian method. If we did this calculation according to the Chinese method, it will be more, because when the Chinese calculate their trade, they also add freight, insurance, handling, etc., etc. In India, we don't do it. So in our calculation, we have a deficit of about $84 billion with China. In the Chinese calculation, it's a little over $100 billion. So with that qualification out, in the old BRICS, India's trade deficit was $125 billion. In the new BRICS, the chart, it becomes $180.9 billion. It's a lot of money, which means, in fact, and see our second chart, that is what the second chart explains to you. What this means is that earlier, old BRICS, that accounted for 47.5% of all of India's trade deficit. India is a large trade deficit country. So unlike China, India is not a trade surplus country. China has a trade surplus of $857 billion. It's a lot of money, almost $1 trillion. India, on the other hand, has a trade deficit of $263 billion. A lot of money in deficit, and that is what worries India all the time. Of that $263 billion, now $180.9 billion will come from the remaining 10 BRICS countries, which means that today 68.8%, 69% you can say, rounding off to the nearest decimal point, 69% of all of India's trade deficit is accounted for by these 10 countries of BRICS. Obviously the weightage there has come in because Saudi Arabia and UAE have come in, and India has large trade deficits with them, mainly because India imports oodles of oil from these countries. The Chinese also have deficit with these countries, but China's overall trade situation is very different, say, from India's. Just for our clarity and simplicity of understanding, please also look at the third chart that we have. If you look at the third chart, see the line in the middle. So the line above the bar, which is not quite Manhattan, cricket commentators say look at the Manhattan. Manhattan in this place is actually below the bar, which means the Manhattan is all on the negative side. That is the deficit, trade deficit that India has. If you look at this chart, this tells you India's trade deficit with various members of BRICS. The original BRICS, that is China, Russia, South Africa and Brazil. With Brazil, in fact, India might have a tiny bit of a wee bit of surplus, and then you have two more skyscrapers coming in, again going below the line, that is UAE and Saudi Arabia. That's happened mainly because of oil. And then you have Egypt, with which India has a small surplus, a tiny surplus, but very little trade, which is a shame. Argentina, a little bit of deficit, but very little trade, which is even more a shame. Then Iran, I can't even say trade is very small. I can't even say it's a shame, because Iran is subject to American sanctions. So it's very difficult to, nearly impossible to trade with Iran unless you want to buck those sanctions. Otherwise, India would be buying a lot of oil from Iran. And then Ethiopia, yet again, India has very little trade. If you convert trade into geopolitics, what it tells you is that with these countries, the existing countries and the new coming countries, either China has much stronger trade relationships than India does, and where India has trade relationships, it invariably results in sizable trade deficits. So that is what gives you a little bit of understanding, a little bit of a different kind of understanding of the grouping that has now been expanded, and the grouping that India has been in for some time now. If you want to see it purely in numbers, you saw these charts, but if you want to see it purely in numbers, with Brazil we have a trade surplus of $3.25 billion, with Russia deficit of nearly $40 billion. That's because we've been buying a lot of oil from Russia, and Russians have been complaining that, look, you are buying this oil, you want to pay in rupees. In any case, you can't pay in dollar because there is sanctions. There are sanctions on dollars, but we don't know what to buy from you for rupees. So our exports to Russia are just over $3 billion. So we have a big trade deficit with Russia. China, according to the way we calculate, our deficit is 83 billion, 83.2 billion. According to the way the Chinese calculate, it's over 100 billion, just over 100 billion. Even in South Africa, we have a deficit. We have a deficit of about 1.92 billion. Once again, if you look at the new members of BRICS, Argentina, deficit of nearly 3 billion. Egypt, surplus of 2.16 billion, but our trade is very little. Ethiopia, hardly any trade, surplus of 0.53 billion. Iran, again, small trade, as I told you. Saudi Arabia, deficit is 31.3 billion, and UAE, 21.6 billion. That is easy to understand because those are countries from which India imports oil. But geopolitically, these are countries which, after their thaw with Iran, Saudi Arabia had a thaw with Iran. You can presume that both these Gulf countries have now near normalized their relationship with Iran, which is really rubbing a finger in the eye of the Americans. And they have all joined a new grouping. New for them. They've joined a new grouping along with Iran. And this is a grouping where China has a very strong overhang. Now, how strong is the Chinese overhang over BRICS? One way of understanding this is to just look at relative GDPs. The current BRICS adds up to the GDPs of all the countries under the current BRICS add up to $27.65 trillion. All this data is from the latest, this is the latest IMF data, $27.65 trillion right now. The existing members, including India. Out of this, China has $19.37 trillion, which means China at this point accounts for 70% of all of the BRICS GDP. So you can say how strong China is. India is the second highest. India accounts for 13.53% of the current BRICS. When BRICS is expanded with the 6 more countries, not some of these countries, not any of these countries is a very large country, so they are not expected to have very large GDPs. Saudi Arabia does not have a small GDP, it still has a GDP of some size, and as does UAE, for example. But if you add these all up, all the new guys up also, then the total size of the GDP of the new BRICS will become $30.76 trillion. Out of this $30.76 trillion, since China will have $19.3 trillion, China would still have 63% of the GDP of the expanded BRICS. It has come down from 63 just because the base has gone up. Instead of 5 countries, you now have 11 countries. But just as China has gone down from 70 to 63, which is still quite formidable, India has gone down as well because the base has increased. India has gone down from 13.5% to 12.16%. So once again, if you look at all this data, look at this chart also, this gives you an idea geopolitically what BRICS is, and geopolitically how strong is China in BRICS. Now we can talk about 20 other things, but that will take 2 more hours, and we will keep revisiting this in the course of time. But I thought at this point, because trade, size of the economy, these things are tangible, where data is available, where authentic data is available, it's important to talk about that right now. Now, why are we talking about trade and economic data? Trade, size of the economy, because the era when a national power, the power of a nation was reckoned primarily in terms of the divisions of the army it had, the number of fighter planes it had, or the number of nuclear weapons it had, or the kind of ICBMs, or the range of its missiles, or the number of nuclear submarines, or the number of aircraft carriers, etc., etc. That time has now changed. Now we talk in terms of comprehensive national power, CNP, or some people also prefer to say GNP, which is gross national power, of that comprehensive national power, economy and trade are very important elements. In fact, they have now become even more important than just military power, because it's rare that the big powers enter into direct military conflict. They exercise their power through the size of their economy and the leverage they have in trade, leverage by way of deciding what they'll import from who and how much will they import for somebody, and also leverage by figuring out how much they can export to who or how much they will export to who, and also that combines into the larger leverage or comprehensive national power where a country or a group of countries can sanction others, and sanctions usually pertain to curtailing another country's trading rights or trading power, which is exactly what's happened with Russia right now after the war in Ukraine. That's what's been happening to Iran for a long time, and that's what keeps on happening between other countries also. Americans in particular love to use the instrument of sanctions. There, if you want to see, just as a denominator of comprehensive national power, I thought before I let you go, I will give you some idea of the Chinese power in the trade business. So I found this bunch of data, in fact a data-based story on a website called visualcapitalist.com. I'm sharing a link with you. You will also see some pages run on your screen, some screenshots run on your screen from visualcapitalist.com, but look at the whole thing, and that gives you the size of China's trade surplus, $857 trillion. When you have that kind of trade surplus, not only is it bringing you so much more free capital reserves. So Chinese foreign exchange reserves are for real. Much more of these are for real, unlike say India's forex surpluses. India's forex surpluses are not really our national surpluses because we don't have a trade surplus. These are money that comes through FDI, money that comes through remittances. Reserve Bank of India keeps this as foreign exchange, issues Indian rupee against it for spending, investments, etc., etc. That's a story we've spoken about in the past, and I know all of you are smart enough to understand the difference of when you build reserves which are primarily built on borrowings and foreign direct investment and trade deficits, as is the case with India, or a set of reserves which are built, yes, on FDI, remittances, etc., as the Chinese do, but also in a very big way, to a very large extent, on persistent trade surpluses, which is what China has. So $857 billion is China's trade surplus. Remember, Chinese also count $100 billion of surplus vis-a-vis India as well. But look at the countries with which China has huge surpluses. The top countries, US. Even now, despite whatever Trump may have tried by imposing tariffs, etc., $401 billion. That is China's surplus with America. Hong Kong, that is neither here nor there because Chinese will export to Hong Kong, Hong Kong will export to the world. So in fact, if you look at China's overall trade surplus, I would also add Hong Kong there because Hong Kong is a province of China now. When it suits them, they calculate Hong Kong separately. That's $287 billion. The Netherlands, number 3, $104.9 billion. Number four is India. That, according to Chinese calculations, $100 billion. Mexico comes next, 59.8, UK at 59.2, and Vietnam, again a country with which the Chinese have some disputes now, particularly in terms of marine boundaries. Vietnam also, the Chinese have a surplus of $56.4 billion. In fact, if on this website, if I look at the chart on visualcapitalist.com, of Chinese trade data with 234 countries and national entities, including say the Holy See, which is the Vatican, right? All of them. If you add all of them together, out of 234, with 176 countries, the Chinese have a trade surplus. The Chinese have a trade surplus, and then deficit begins actually with Cuba, with which China hardly has any trade. And then we come to some countries with which China has sizable trade deficits, and once again, very interesting, China's largest trade deficit, guess which is the country China is running the largest trade deficit with. You might think instinctively that maybe it's Russia, maybe it's Saudi Arabia because the Chinese import a lot of oil from there, but no, answer is not that. Answer is Taiwan. Taiwan, which China actually considers a part of their country, right? Taiwan, the Chinese have a deficit of $155 billion. That's a humongous deficit. The largest deficit the Chinese are running is with Taiwan. Then there is Australia, 63.6. I'm sure they are importing a lot of minerals from Australia. Brazil, 47.6. I'm sure minerals, corn, stuff like that. Switzerland, 42.1. Then Saudi Arabia comes at $40 billion. Then Saudi Arabia, Russia, again a non-oil exporting country. Republic of Korea, that is South Korea. Chinese have a deficit of nearly $38 billion. And then there are again oil exporting countries like Oman, Iraq. Again in the top 10, in fact at number 10, a very interesting country, Chile. With Chile, the Chinese have a trade deficit of $22.08 billion. No prizes for guessing where it's coming from. I'm quite sure a lot of it is coming from lithium, because Chinese have become a global power now in electric vehicles, and electric vehicles need batteries, and those batteries need lithium, and a lot of the world's lithium sits in the mines of Chile. So that is the power that the Chinese exercise across the world, because not only have they become very big sellers, they've also become very big buyers, particularly from countries which are selling valuable raw materials. These range from, say, crude oil to minerals. That's why Chile is number 10 among countries China is running trade deficits with. Besides, then you have Kuwait and Qatar, but once again in the middle you have Angola, which is again more than $19 billion, and I'm quite sure it's all to do with minerals from Angola. In fact, Japan comes somewhere in the 15th spot with about $11 billion. So that tells you the story of China's economic power. And also, by looking at China's trade, one, you can see to the extent to which they dominate BRICS, but you can also see the larger picture, whereby they can use their trade, their power to buy or sell, to influence countries across the world, although mostly the trade balance works to their benefit.